All right, thank you, Dick, for the introduction. Thanks to all of you for being here physically in the room, and for those of us who are joining virtually, thank you as well. And thank you to C-STAR and the University of South Carolina for the invitation. It is a real pleasure to be here. So as Dick said, a lot of the work that I've been doing with colleagues together at VA Pittsburgh has been focused on predictors and mechanisms of naming, treatment, response, and aphasia. What I'm going to be talking about today is highly collaborative work, which is the product of work by our entire investigative team, including Pat Doyle, Will Evans, Michelle Gravier, and Will Hula. And in addition, our students and our partner clinicians who do a lot of the hard work related to administering treatment as part of the treatment studies, including Alyssa Otenreith, Angela Grzybowski, Gina Kike, Rebecca Ruffing, and Ron Winans-Mitrick. Most of what I'm going to be talking about today is focused on behavioral predictors and mechanisms rather than neural predictors and mechanisms, though that is something that we're actively interested in, and if people are interested, I'm happy to talk about that in the question period. So as we all know, naming deficits, word retrieval deficits, are a very prominent and functionally relevant feature of aphasia. And impairment or model-oriented naming treatments can typically target one of two levels of encoding. The first of them is lexical semantic selection, going from an idea that you have to selecting a particular concept and lexical semantic representation to go along with that. Two example treatments which target this level are semantic feature analysis and the closely allied also feature-based, complexity-based naming treatment that Swati Kira has developed. In complement to that, naming treatments, word retrieval treatments, can also target phonological encoding, mapping from a particular lexical semantic representation to a particular word form. And a couple of examples of treatments which focus on that level of function are Diane Kendall and colleagues' phonomotor treatment and phonological components analysis developed by Elizabeth Rochon and colleagues, which is reminiscent structure of semantic feature analysis, though focused on phonology. Now, one thing that's worthy of note about both these kinds of approaches is that they have evidence of efficacy in improving naming performance. And in particular, they have good evidence of improving retrieval of specifically treated words, treatment targets, but somewhat more limited evidence of response generalization, improving retrieval of words which aren't the direct focus of treatment, but which might be related in some way. However, they both have the property of having broad variability in their outcomes. In particular, it's not clear to date which individuals benefit the most from naming treatments in general or from specific naming treatments, or from which particular kind of treatment they're going to benefit the most, that focused on the lexical semantic stage or that focused on the phonological stage. This quote from a systematic review following up on some earlier work, classic work by Nichols in 2002, sums it up nicely. The large standard deviations seen throughout this study, their systematic review of naming treatment outcomes, are an indication that therapeutic gains are highly variable. We still have little knowledge as to what type of therapy works best for individual patient characteristics. And that's a big part of what motivates the talk, what I'm going to be talking about today, and an ongoing VA trial, which I'll be presenting some results from. So naming treatments which target the first area of domain of naming, lexical semantic selection, seem to have evidence of showing relatively good evidence of promoting generalization. Semantic feature analysis and related semantic feature-based treatments result in improved naming of related but untreated targets. They also may show larger improvements for related untreated targets than phonologically oriented naming treatments too, though there's some active discussion related to that in the literature. Importantly, semantic naming treatments also engender positive change in broader measures of communicative function, like connected speech, as well as broad measures of language impairment, like aphasia assessments. What I'm going to be focusing on for the rest of the talk today is one particular semantically oriented naming treatment, which is semantic feature analysis. Semantic feature analysis looks kind of like this. This is a particular implementation of this that we use in the clinical service at VA Pittsburgh. And what semantic feature analysis does is it presents clients with targets, like a rollerblade in this case, and it provides them with an opportunity to generate relevant semantic features across a set of categories. And the goal of that is to stimulate conceptual and lexical semantic representations, thereby facilitating naming. That is the chassis on which this treatment is built. That is the mechanism which it presupposes as the locus of its positive effects, something we're going to be coming back to several points during the talk today. Now, SFA naming treatment is worthy of study, I think, in detailed study for a few different reasons. First, it has a large research base among treatment studies out there. So starting from the first application of it to aphasia by Boyle and Coelho in 1995, to date there are 17 published single subject control studies involving 54 unique people with aphasia. It's resulted in positive effects on naming ability, engendered improvements for participants with a wide variety of aphasia types and severities, as pointed out by Mary Boyle in her 2010 systematic review, among others. And it's also, importantly, very commonly used in clinical practice. So, for example, in VA Pittsburgh's PIRATE intensive aphasia treatment program. So this is a treatment with good evidence, a rich evidence base for us to explore, which is also commonly used in clinical practice, which provides us ample reason to dig into it in more detail. So SFA, like other naming treatments, it's worth saying, also shows significant variability in response to it. So as there is for all other naming treatments, as we'll come back to when we talk about a couple of different meta-analyses a little bit later today in the talk. Importantly, identifying sources and markers of this variability can have at least two positive outcomes. First of all, it can potentially improve service delivery by identifying individuals who are especially likely to respond well to this particular intervention. But also, importantly, scientifically, it can shed light on the mechanisms which underlie SFA treatment response. And this is an opportunity to satisfy both of those desires, advancing clinical service and scientific understanding at the same time. Now, and that's going to motivate our work in this talk. And we're going to look at characterizing that variability along a few different domains. First, we're going to spend some time talking about and looking for person-level predictors of treatment response. So both clinical impression and systematic reviews and meta-analyses have documented variability in SFA treatment response. But it's worth noting that to date, no studies have attempted to characterize this variability. So the person-level variables that may predict more or less positive SFA response are unknown. It's worth noting that Matt Lemon, Ralph and colleagues have done some work in this regard, landmark work for phonological and orthographic cueing. Gilmore, Johnson, and Kiran have done some work, have some recent work in their group looking at factors which might condition responses to allied features, but no one has examined this for SFA to date. Similarly, we don't know which particular aspects of SFA treatment contribute most strongly to the positive response that we see. In that domain, we want to look at practice-related predictors. So the individual components of this particular complex intervention, SFA, like all interventions, is complex, might contribute differentially to treatment response. So it could be simple time in treatment, the time spent at therapeutic interaction with a trained individual, or it could be specific treatment activities which are responsible for the gains that we see. So for example, it could be the number of treatment trials that a person completes, opportunities for retrieval of a particular treated word form. Or alternatively, it could be the specific number of treatment activities that the person engages in. And for SFA, those specific treatment activities are feature generation. Remember, their people are guided in generating semantically related features. All of these can vary across clinicians and clients, and even across stimuli within a clinical interaction or a research study. It's unclear to date which of these components is the active ingredient in SFA intervention. Finally, I think most relevant to the last part, the mechanisms, we're interested in digging into person-level differences which characterize this response, not only broadly, but more specifically in particular, looking at psycholinguistic factors which might be predictive of treatment response. There's evidence out there that the nature of word retrieval deficits may be important for characterizing variability in SFA response. So for example, there's evidence suggesting that positive SFA response has been reported for people with phonological, semantic, and mixed word retrieval deficits. Again, a variety of people can benefit from this. However, there is other evidence out there from slightly different body of work suggesting that people with semantic deficits appear to show the greatest benefit for SFA, as well as other semantically oriented naming treatments. We know from Matt Lam and Ralph's work that phonological processing ability may be predictive of naming a treatment response, particularly for orthographic and phonological cueing, but this hasn't been examined for SFA to date. And this can potentially shed mechanism on the mechanisms which are responsible for SFA-related improvements. If we know who is more or less likely to benefit, we have an insight, a window into what the relevant mechanisms which are leveraged to engender that benefit might be. So with that in mind, I want to set us up with 3 research questions that we'll be exploring for the rest of the talk. The first of these is simple yes/no questions. Can we identify person-level predictors of response to SFA for treated items or ideally untreated items? The goal of treatment is not simply to improve on the particular skills or behaviors or items that you're working on in the context of a treatment room, but rather to generalize that treatment benefit to other as yet unencountered but potentially related stimuli. That's the ultimate goal of efficacious aphasia treatment. Second, which aspects of SFA intervention, either time and treatment or specific treatment activities, contribute the most to treatment response? And do they contribute similarly to improvement on treated and untreated items? And finally, can we identify psycholinguistic measures, be they of semantic abilities, phonological abilities, or both, that are predictive of SFA treatment response? And again, the question is the same. Are they predictive of improvement on treated items or extension to untreated but related items? And we're going to address that in 3 different studies using different methods to get at these questions. The first of these is a study tackling the first question, identifying person-level predictors. And this is a meta-analysis which is led by my PhD student, Gina Kike, in collaboration with my colleague, Will Evans at University of Pittsburgh and VA Pittsburgh. Now, most of the evidence to date of SFA's efficacy for improving naming comes primarily from multiple baseline single subject design studies. Now, those studies have systematic advantages. Each subject in such a study serves as his or her own control across baseline and treatment phases, and they inherently take into account the variability across individuals, which is characteristic of people with aphasia. However, these advantages are offset by corresponding disadvantages. Because we're looking at relatively small samples, which are not aggregated across studies, these may obscure person-level differences in SFA response, either acquisition of the treated stimuli or generalization to untreated stimuli. Furthermore, they systematically deprive us of the opportunity to examine differences across studies. Studies may differ importantly in dosage, the amount of treatment which is administered to a particular individual or group of individuals within the study, as well as differences in stimuli. These studies, if you look at the existing corpus of SFA treatment studies that's published to date, vary, for example, in whether the untreated or generalization stimuli are semantically related to the treatment stimuli or not. We don't have a clear view of how important that dimension of stimulus, the stimuli is to the likelihood of generalization. In order to get at these questions, what we need are larger sample studies, or alternatively, analyses which aggregate existing data in order to get at these questions. And what I'm going to talk about now, this meta-analysis takes that latter approach, aggregating existing data. Now, there are existing systematic reviews out there and meta-analyses of SFA treatment studies. These have traditionally used effect size metrics to measure treatment effects, which basically boils down to a single observation per participant measuring the degree of improvement on a relevant behavior from baseline to follow-up, from pre to post treatment. Now, these studies have provided some group-level evidence of SFA's efficacy in improving retrieval of treated and untreated items, though stronger evidence for improvement of treated items, it's worth noting. And they've also provided evidence of positive change on broader measures. So, for example, general measures of naming impairment, like the Boston Naming Test, as well as overall measures of aphasia severity, like the Western Aphasia Battery. This is a meta-analysis which was published by O and colleagues in 2016, which is which is in Korean, though fortunately for me as a non-Korean speaker, has all of its tables in English. It's worth saying that these studies have not examined a set of questions which are central to the questions that we're asking today. First of all, they haven't directly examined the effects of person-level differences on the gains for either treated or untreated items. We don't know whether there are traits out there in the literature that are associated with better SFA treatment response. This is relevant to identifying those person-level predictors. Also, to date, they haven't examined the effects of stimulus type on gains for untreated items. They've pretty much all looked at the difference between treated and untreated items. But among the untreated items, there's been no examination of whether semantically related items exhibit greater gains in response to intervention across people with aphasia. And this is critical because this is what we would expect is if SFA is stimulating the processes and representations which it's supposed to, stimulating semantic representations. None of these studies to date have examined the effects of dosage. And this is critical for optimizing treatment. We know there's variability in how much treatment individuals are receiving, but we have no models to date, explicit or otherwise, of how that variation in amount of dosage contributes to the responses that we see. And this is critical for the next step of aphasia treatment, which is optimizing treatments which we know are efficacious based on other studies. So study one went after this question by doing a meta-analysis, analyzing, instead of effect sizes changed from pre to post, probe-level naming data from 12 published single-subject controlled SFA treatment studies with data from 35 people with aphasia in total. We used logistic mixed effects regression models to measure the effects of treatment-related and person-specific variables on probe performance. What I mean by that specifically is the odds of a correct naming response and how that's affected by variables of interest. So, for example, person-level differences, as well as the amount of treatment a particular individual has received. Now, it's worth noting, while these kinds of approaches have been used in other kinds of analyses, including meta-analyses of some experimental data out there, Shravan Vasish at Potsdam has used this. This is a novel approach to meta-analysis within this literature. So what we did specifically was we went to the published data and we extracted from either published tables or the figures individual probe level naming data. We extracted data from treated items here circled in blue, and untreated or generalization items here circled in pink. And these are the classic single subject controlled experimental design plots. We extracted these data and entered them into a model. It's worth noting that these kinds of data are especially well suited to examining the varying effects of dosage, because what we can see is changes of accuracy, probe performance, as it's modulated across increasing doses, continuously increasing doses of treatment, numbers of treatment sessions in particular. That's how we're operationalizing that. So in these mixed effects models, we examined, first of all, treatment-related factors. These were fixed effects in these models for treatment phase, baseline versus treatment, stimulus type, treated versus untreated, as well as within the untreated class, semantically related versus unrelated. And critically, dosage, the number of SFA treatment sessions, and how that predicted performance for naming probe data. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to walk you through the results for most of these treatment-related variables. I'm just going to tell you that these basically all had the expected effects. There was better performance in the treatment phase compared to the baseline, for treated items compared to untreated items, and importantly, for related compared to unrelated items. That's something that hasn't been demonstrated before, we're saying. However, I will show you briefly what we found for dosage. What I plotted here is model predictions for performance, percent correct performance across time with increasing amounts of dosage. Treated items are in blue, generalization items or untreated items are in pink. And what you can see on the x-axis, this is percentage predicted, percentage correct. What you can see on the x-axis is dosage. This is the number of treatment sessions that people have received. And what we can say is that averaging across treatment studies and across these 35 individuals is we can now have an estimate of the dose-response relationship for this intervention. The odds of correct naming response increased by a factor of 1.09 for log odds. That's an increase of 1.8% in naming probe accuracy with each additional SFA treatment session. So we now have a direct quantified measure of how much we may anticipate that a typical individual, averaging across individuals, should benefit from each additional session of SFA. Now, with respect to the person-level variables, we looked at both demographic variables and a couple of different language impairment variables. Overall aphasia severity, that was measured by WAB here, as well as naming deficit severity, that was measured by BNT, that was found for most of the studies. Again, in the interest of time, I'll jump ahead and tell you that there were no effects of the demographic variables, nor were there any effects of pre-intervention naming deficit severity as measured by BNT performance. However, there was a robust effect of aphasia severity. And I've given you some rather complicated plots to illustrate that. So what I've shown you here again, these are predicted accuracies. On the left are predicted accuracies pre-treatment versus predicted accuracies in naming terms post-treatment. And what's on the x-axis for these two different plots is relative aphasia severity, and this is z-score transformed. So what you can see is that there's, what you can see illustrated here is a three-way interaction between aphasia severity, treatment phase, and stimulus type, treated versus untreated. What I mean by that is that the disadvantage for untreated items in response during the treatment phase is smaller for people with milder aphasia. So the separation between the blue and the pink lines is smaller for people with milder aphasia on the right. What this means is that having a higher WAB-AQ, milder aphasia, is associated with better generalization, more gain for untreated items. So coming out of this study, we have group level evidence again for the efficacy of SFA, expanding on Boyle and O's previous work. Owen and colleagues' previous work. And we also have evidence that SFA response generalization is greater for semantically related untreated items than for unrelated. And that's consistent with a hypothesized basis for SFA's positive effect, stimulation of the semantic system. And for purposes today, critically, we now have a detailed characterization of variability in SFA response. Encouragingly, it doesn't look like it's affected by age or time post-onset. But we have identified aphasia severity as a promising person-level predictor. Milder aphasia is associated with better SFA response, in particular, better response generalization to untreated items. And it's worth noting as a clinical take-home, this measure is easily available to clinicians and can be also importantly controlled for in other studies prospectively and analyses. We also have a preliminary estimate for the dosage effects for SFA, just how much better varying amounts of SFA can be expected to make people with respect to primary outcomes of naming performance. So given that we know not only that more treatment is better, but roughly how much more each unit of treatment is better, this puts us in a position to shift to our second question. Which aspects of SFA intervention, time and treatment or specific treatment activities contribute most to treatment response for treated as well as untreated items? And for this, I'd like to, for study 2, is analyzing data from an ongoing trial. I'd like to call out my colleague Michelle Gravier, as well as my colleague Will Evans, who've taken the lead in analyzing these data in an IMPRESS article, which we just found out will appear in March after apparently forever. So let me tell you about the studies, the methods which are common to both studies 2 and 3. These are 38 participants from an ongoing VA-funded trial for which my colleague Pat Doyle and I are co-PIs at VA Pittsburgh. These are all individuals with chronic aphasia due to a single left hemisphere CVA. There are only 5 females in the sample because this is drawing primarily from veteran populations, which tend to skew male. They all have diagnosed naming impairment and range widely in their age, their time post-onset, their educational attainment, as well as their aphasia severity. The particular measure that we're going to be using for aphasia severity for the rest of the talk is modality mean t-score from the comprehensive aphasia test, which is centered at 50 with standard deviations of 10 on either side. In addition to the comprehensive aphasia test to characterize these people's language impairments, we also gave them a detailed language assessment to determine the level of their word retrieval deficits. We gave them a general measure of naming performance, the Philadelphia naming test, as well as phonological ability measures and semantic ability measures. And I'll come back and talk more about those when we talk about study 3. Now, all of these individuals received 4 weeks of intensive semantic feature analysis treatment. So 4 to 5 days a week for 4 weeks in 220-minute sessions per day. Across the individuals in this sample, they received 58 hours of intervention. I can see many people's eyes opening wide. The clients and the clinicians' eyes opened wide as well. The majority of the individuals in the participants in the study have received 3 treatment lists, consisting of 5 treatment targets and 5 untreated but related exemplars. And we advanced across lists using the standard criteria which are accepted in the single subject design literature. It's worth noting that our current sample is up to 42 with 2 more folks in the pipeline. So we're aiming for 50. Fingers crossed we'll get all the way there. So these are the session level data, the naming probe data, similar to the kind of data that you saw for the previous study, for study 1. This is an example from probes for list 1 from one of our participants. Let me orient you to the actual data that I'm going to be talking about that we analyzed for the purpose of studies 2 and 3. What we did was, for trained and untrained items, we analyzed accuracy in performance in probes for those treated and untreated items immediately prior to the start of intervention, the yellow shaded area there, and immediately prior to discharge from the study. Now, as people advanced across lists, the amount of time in between discharge from the study, the end of the 4 weeks, and the end of intervention for that list varied. So we're seeing some, so the numbers that we're analyzing for this study exit for some lists reflect some natural decrement, which is associated with not being an immediate focus of treatment in the immediately recent past. So what we did was we subjected these data to Bayesian multi-level generalized linear models. So these are Bayesian extensions of the logistic mixed effect models that we talked about before. These contain random intercepts for subject and word, as well as fixed effects for time, so pre to post treatment, item type, treated versus untreated, as well as practice-related predictors for study 2, and psycholinguistic predictors for study 3. It's also worth noting that we entered as a control variant in all of these studies pre-treatment aphasia severity. And that's important because the results of study 1 suggest that pre-treatment aphasia severity does moderate treatment-related gains. So what that means is this entering these aphasia severity as a covariate means that the effects that you see of different practice-related or psycholinguistic predictors are over and above any variance which is explained by overall aphasia severity. We fit these models in open bugs with uninformative priors with an initial 1,000 iteration burn-in and then 2 chains of 10,000 iterations to estimate the parameters. All right, so before I tell you the detailed studies, sort of detailed analysis and study for studies 2 and 3, let me give you some basic information for the overall results from this intervention to demonstrate that it has the kind of effects that we anticipate that treatment will have. First of all, there were positive changes in performance for the naming stimuli from baseline to treatment phase. And we measured this using the tau-u single subject experimental design statistic developed by Parker and colleagues. This is a especially useful statistic because it allows you to correct for trends in baseline, which are extremely common in single subject experimental designs. And what we found was that there was a significant change of 0.45 tau-u over baseline for treated and untreated stimuli while controlling for a baseline trend. Importantly, we also saw positive changes on measures of broader communicative function. So CAP modality mean T-score, which is modality mean T-score, which is the measure of overall aphasia severity, showed a gain of 0.7 treatment point 0.7 t-score points post-treatment, while controlling for a 0.05 point weekly trend during the baseline. So we saw some upward trend, but a much smaller trend during the baseline, and these analyses directly control for that. And we also saw happily improvements in connected speech in the Nicholas and Brookshire narratives that we collected from all study participants. We saw a 10% increase in the number of CIUs post-treatment. So this looks like this treatment engenders the kind of changes that you would hope that any aphasia treatment would. All right, so with that in mind, now let me turn to the specifics, first off, of Study 2. Study 2 was interested in examining the effect of practice-related factors. And we added a number of practice-related factors to these models as predictor variables or fixed effects. The first of these was time in treatment, the total number of minutes spent in treatment, which could in principle have a positive facilitative effect. The second, more specific treatment activity, which we entered in, was the number of treatment trials, the number of word form retrieval attempts that participants engaged in, because every trial begins and ends with either successful retrieval of the named object or repetition of that object name word form by the patient. We also entered the number of features generated, which recall is the core SFA treatment activity, and which is supposed to be the active ingredient in SFA. Now, it's worth noting that we analyzed these data at and the effects of these fixed effect factors at the item level, right? And that's valuable because it reflects natural variation across participants and stimuli. Some stimuli inherently have received more trials of practice. Some generate more particular, some generate more features. Some have longer time in treatment. There is a lot of variability across the collective data set here, which we took advantage of to actively explore to examine the effects of these variables. Now, unfortunately, the formatting which I worked on the plane, it got a little bit off. My apologies about that. The spoiler, there were no effects of time in treatment. So there was absolutely no effect for treated and untreated or untreated items in the amount of time that people spent with them measured in minutes. However, there were important and interesting effects of the two more specific treatment activities, the number of treatment trials and the number of features generated. And let me talk to you about what those results were, what those findings were, starting with the number of trials. So what I plotted for you here is model predictions of the percent correct at pre-treatment and post-treatment for treated and untreated items, the treated again in blue, the untreated in pink. What's plotted here is a split for low versus high trials, plus or minus 0.5, plus or minus 1 standard deviation around the mean. Difference between the items which enlisted an average of 26, had received a number of 26 practice opportunities versus 55 for high. The high are marked with a triangle, the low are marked with a circle. What you can see here is consistent with everything else that we've seen, a robust effect of treatment from pre to post, as well as an effect of item type. So the treated items improved much more than the untreated items did. That's not uncommon in aphasia studies and it's in SFA studies. Now, to take a look at these results in a little bit more detail, what this shows high density credible, 95% credible intervals and associated histograms for those 4 conditions. The top rows represent the treated items in the high trials treated items versus low trials treated items, and untreated items are on the bottom, high trials treated items on the left, and low trials treated untreated items on the right. What you can see here is that the 95% high density credible intervals, which are the black bars there, are comfortably to the right of 0 for all 4 of these, indicating that there was a significant change from pre to post treatment. About 50% for high trials treated items, about 48% for low trials treated items, and right around 10% for high and low trials untreated items. Now, to show you the interactions for these, again, plotted in terms of high density credible intervals. What you can see here, looking on the left at the treated items, there is a significant interaction, a reliable interaction of time pre-post and treated and high trials versus low trial items. What that means is that that small difference, that 2% difference for high trials treated items compared to low trials treated items was significant. It was a robust and reliable difference. For the untreated items, which were, but they both hovered, the low and high trials hovered around 10%, that was not a robust, reliable difference. The confidence interval comfortably covers 0. What that means is we can say with significant confidence, about 95% confidence, that this effect is likely 0. So that's the picture for the number of trials or word form retrieval attempts. Now let's take a look at the effect of the number of features generated. Here we see a very different picture. Here what we see is, again, robust changes from pre to post, but we see clear moderation of these changes for both treated and untreated items by whether that item elicited many generated features or relatively few generated features. Again, triangles for high features per trial, circles for low numbers of features per trial. And the range for high versus low is 6.5 to 10 features per trial. Now, in terms of, I've given you again here the high density credible intervals. What you can see here, again, treated at the top, untreated on the bottom. What you can see is a robust effect of treatments, a robust change from pre to post of about for both of the treated categories, though significantly larger for the many features items on the left than for the few features items on the right. So 60% increase in accuracy for the many features versus a 33% increase in accuracy for the few features. For the untreated items, the many features items are elicited a 14% increase on average from pre to post. Again, that's comfortably above 0, as indicated by the high density credible interval. However, that high density credible interval does cover 0 for the low features untreated items. And as you can see, the increase is much smaller. And these are simply the interactions which depict that. So study 2 suggests examining the effects of these different practice-related predictors suggests that different aspects of SFA intervention contributed differently to the gains. The number of treatment trials, the attempts at word form retrieval, predicted improvement for treated but not untreated or generalization items. In contrast, the number of features generated was predictive for both treated and, importantly, untreated items. And as a matter of fact, the cell where we saw the least improvement was for untreated items, which elicited few features per trial. Now, it's worth noting that the features that were being generated in this treatment task were specific to the treated items, right? They were generating semantic features in response to particular treated items, not for untreated items. In some ways, this is a surprisingly and delightfully distal effect of this feature generation activity. They weren't generating features which were directly related to the untreated items. This is mediated by semantic relationships, which presumably reflect conceptual and lexical semantic similarity, which will come, in fact, we'll come back to in a minute. And this provides evidence that the act of feature generation is the active ingredient of SFA. Now, it's worth noting with a couple of clinical take-homes that these findings may favor treatment approaches that target discrete processing steps that can be shared across lexical items, which may promote generalization. So lexical semantic activation in the context of SFA, mapping from conceptual semantic representations to lexical items, or potentially sublexical phonological encoding, as in Diane Kendall's phonomotor treatment. And this also has an important clinical take-home for practice. It's worth focusing practice during SFA treatment on feature generation rather than trial repetition. You're going to get more bang for your treatment buck if you invest more client time in elaborated feature generation, presumably because you're stimulating the semantic system. However, that last part, that last clause, presumably because you're stimulating the semantic system, brings us to our last question. Do psycholinguistic measures of semantic abilities, phonological abilities, or both predict SFA treatment response? And this is a study in preparation now. Again, I want to call out my colleagues Michel Gravier, Will Coelho, and my co-PI, Pat Doyle. So this was this is analyzing data, treatment data taken from the same sample of individuals. Recall we've got these. We have the comprehensive aphasia test and the PNT, and we also collected detailed measures of people's phonological and semantic processing ability pre-intervention. The phonological ability measures consist of receptively focused palpa subtests, as well as p-weight, which is derived from error pattern performance on the Philadelphia naming task. This is mapping, deriving predictions regarding the error patterns, or fitting error patterns to Feigl and Dell's computationally implemented model of a two-step interactive model of lexical access, which, time permitting, we'll see about in just a few minutes. P-weight indexes the strength of the connections or the mappings from lexical semantic representations to phonological representations. In complement to that, we measured semantic processing ability based on synonym judgment palpa subtests and S-weight. S-weight, again, determined based on PNT performance, measures the strength of connections or the mapping between conceptual semantic representations and lexical representations. We used these psycholinguistic measures as predictors in the kinds of models I described above. In the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on P-weight and S-weight, phonological ability and semantic ability. Let me show you the data for the phonological factor first. What you can see here is, again, you're seeing the change pre to post, which is moderated in part by phonological processing ability. However, I'm going to skip ahead simply to the interactions in the interest of time. That benefit, the added benefit of being good at phonological processing pre-intervention, showing greater gain, about a 9% greater gain pre to post, is unique to treated items. There's no evidence based on these data that better phonological processing ability moderates the amount of gain experienced for untreated items. So phonological processing ability is specific to treated items. Let's take a look at the semantic factor, S-weight. Here, what we see is that, here I'm going to focus just on these credible intervals, again, in the interest of time. What you can see is high S-weight individuals showed greater gains for treated items than low S-weight individuals. And high S-weight individuals showed greater gains on untreated items than low S-weight individuals. And this simply depicts those interactions. So the variability in the magnitude of SFA-related improvement on naming probes specifically is characterized by psycholinguistic ability or level of deficit. But it interacts critically with a particular stimulus type. Both P-weight and S-weight predicted the likelihood of naming improvement for treated items. That's what the two separate sets of analyses suggested. However, S-weight only moderated the likelihood of improvement for untreated items. It looks like there was no effective P-weight on the degree of improvement seen for untreated items. Didn't matter whether you were a high or low S-weight individual. With respect to the amount of gain that you saw pre to post treatment. And this is interestingly constant and consistent with the study 2 findings for practice-related predictors, as well as from the naming treatment literatures. Semantic abilities were predictive of treatment gains for both treated and untreated items, and the number of semantic features that were generated, the opportunities to stimulate the semantic system, showed a similar pattern. This actually aligns with findings in the phonologically-oriented naming treatment literature, suggesting that repeated practice in retrieving specific word forms in response to phonological cueing treatments results in improvements for those items, but less consistent generalization to untreated items. And this also provides us with some possible insight into the mechanisms which are behind, the cognitive mechanisms which are behind SFA treatment benefits. It's an open question. Does SFA work by stimulating semantic representations, as sort of classically assumed by people developing this approach and applying it to naming treatment of aphasia? Does it work by facilitating word form retrieval, implicitly targeting phonological processes, or both? Well, the current findings suggest that both phonological and semantic processing contribute to improvement for treated items, but only semantic processing affects improvement for untreated or generalization items. This semantic processing ability critically mediates generalization. And it's worth noting, we're not the first people to observe this. Marina Schwartz and Adele Brecker found that S-weight predicted the likelihood of spontaneous recovery of naming, not treatment-related recovery of naming, in a sample of people with aphasia, small sample. People with higher S-weight showed more spontaneous improvement. We can also map this explicitly onto to existing interactive activation models of lexical access and processing. So let's talk about how SFA might work in the context of Feigl and Dell's 2000 model, 2000 SP model of lexical retrieval in the for production. So suppose for a moment that your target or your client's target is cat. So the first step is for the client to generate different features. So for example, this is a pet associated with category. It has fur, it has that property. You feed it, that's its use, right? Those S-weight connections then spread activation to cat as well as to the semantically related competitor dog, which also shares those features. When your client then generates the additional feature, it meows in the morning to wake me up, a personal association, that then spreads activation specifically to cat, resulting in higher activation of cat compared to dog. That's how SFA would work with respect to this specific model, with S-weight connections mediating this feed-forward of activation. Now, in complement to that, you have simultaneous activation of this is how word form retrieval would work. So when your client, either on her or his own, or in response to clinician prompt, retrieves a particular word form, the first step is to activate the sublexical phonological representations associated with that. The bidirectional P-weight connections then spread that activation back to the targeted word form. However, they don't spread activation. That results in activation in backwards flowing activation in reverse for the target word form, but no real activation for the competitor because it doesn't overlap phonologically. What this results in is cumulatively across acts of feature generation and word form retrieval, greater stimulation and activation of target forms, but partial stimulation or activation of lexical semantic representations of competitor word forms, related word forms like dog. Now, the S and P weight values critically mediate the relationships here between patient-generated features, retrieved word forms, and treated and related untreated lexical representations. They are literally the mechanism which makes these relationships and stimulations possible. And that is, in fact, exactly the pattern of results that we find in our studies, in the study results to date. Word form retrieval and P-weight critically mediate gains for treated items, but they have no strong effect for gains on untreated items. S-weight connections, as well as feature generation, mediate gains for treated items as well as untreated related items. So to wrap up, in study one, we saw that we can identify a person-level marker of likely SFA treatment response, and in particular, likelihood of response generalization. And this particular marker is easily available to clinicians, which can inform treatment choices potentially, as well as prognosis. Study two suggested that variation-specific treatment activities, rather than overall time in treatment, contributes to the variability in response that we see. Not only is more treatment better, which we have a measure of from study one, but more specific practice, specific elements of treatment is better. We also have evidence that the variability in SFA treatment response is explained by variability in phonological and semantic abilities, with semantic ability being especially critical for generalization in response to this intervention. And this is consistent with those study two results, suggesting that stimulation and semantic representation is the key ingredient, and with these current models of lexical retrieval and its impairments, in particular the SP model. It's worth noting that there's still a lot of variability to explain, and we need to examine the joint contributions of other factors, including neuropsychological factors, for example, attention, memory, visual-spatial processing, as well as lesion-related variables. With respect to this latter question, the group here has been really leading the way in trying to forward our understanding in that regard. And we're hoping to follow along behind you guys in the not too distant future. So with that, I want to thank our funders, our colleagues at the VA Pittsburgh Healthcare Systems, GREC, the VA Pittsburgh's Program for Intensive Residential Aphasia Treatment Education, in particular our patient coordinator, Mary Sullivan, and our hardworking and indefatigable clinical staff, and above all, the people with aphasia who have generously volunteered to participate in our studies. And thanks to all of you.
I guess we start with questions from the room here, and then we'll monitor for online questions as well.
I told you I was going to ask you the clinical question.
Okay.
So as an SLP, I'm always trying to figure out how do we translate this into real life. And as you know, you work with a lot of speech language pathologists where we're constantly battling therapy gaps. So a couple of questions about study 2. You said that it wasn't so much the time, it was the trials.
Yes.
Are those trials spread over a long period of time, a short period of time?
Yeah,
how is that?
That's a terrific question. So there are additional service delivery. Okay, yeah, sorry, thank you. So for those playing at home, so the question was, with respect to study 2, thinking about how this speaks to service delivery questions. If we find a robust effect of trials on acquisition of treated items or features generally generated for generalization of untreated items, how does that interface with what kind of schedule you provide that therapy on? Are these, is it better to deliver it sort of intensively over an extensive periods and more distributed practice? The short answer to this question is we don't know, and we can't answer based on the results from this study. This is all administered in the context of intensive aphasia rehabilitation. These people are working hard for 4 weeks, for 4 hours a day. So unfortunately, and these are all people in the chronic phase. They were all at least 6 months post-onset at the start of study participation, ranging all the way out to 275 months post-onset. So really, truly chronic folks. Yeah. But it's a great question. I would love to, one of the questions I'd love to know the answer to next.
I was wondering, specifically with reference to studies 1 and 2,
yes,
you've investigated separately, basically, participant variables and study variables. And I was just wondering, to what extent are you able with these studies to look at the interaction between those? So for example, I can well imagine that in the second study, which is very intensive, that some of that intensity may work better for people who are a little bit more in a chronic stage, versus in an earlier stage after stroke, or age-related effects that interact with the study.
Absolutely. So the question is, in studies 1 and 2, particularly in study 1, and the way that I set it up, we talked about looking at treatment-related, study-related variables and person-related variables separately. And the question was, what happens, how do we put those into the same model, and what happens when you do? So the short answer is we have put together some of these variables together in the same model. There is a challenge with putting too many variables together in the same model. There are threats to convergence, and particularly when you move to Bayesian extensions, those sort of the computational labor and effort involved needed to guarantee convergence for those is non-trivial. However, what I can say is that with respect to the study 1 variables, we have explicitly looked at the interaction between treatment-specific variables, so for example, the change from baseline to treatment, and person-level variables. So the degree of, not only the degree of overall aphasia severity, but age and time post-onset. So with respect to the meta-analytic study, we found no interaction effects either for age or time postals. That means so we found neither main effects nor where they were in the chronic phase. Similarly, for studies 2 and 3, we have entered at least some person-level variables in as covariates. So I mentioned, for example, overall aphasia severity. That is, in some models itself, independently a robust predictor. In other models, interestingly, it's not. It looks like the other variables eat up most of the variance that overall aphasia severity accounts for. But what we can see is that these relationships survive and persist even above that. What I can't answer in a definite way right now, and I won't try to answer this because I don't want to say something which my colleagues at home are going to cringe as I say out loud. I'm not sure whether we've specifically addressed the interaction of demographic variables and these other variables of interest. So for example, different practice-related predictors in the context of the study 2 and 3 analyses. So but it's a good question, it's worth pursuing.
So I guess related as a follow-on, it's hard to model overall aphasia severity. If you think of people who have very little deficit, their ability to get better is really limited. People who have a tremendous deficit may have very little skills to get better. So how is the best way to scale improvement?
That's an excellent question. So the question from Chris Worden was, we know that aphasia severity may impact, I'm going to paraphrase your question slightly if that's okay. We know that aphasia severity may have variable and possibly nonlinear effects on the degree of improvement that may be obtained. So people at the very mild end may show very little room to improve because they're essentially already close to ceiling, whereas people, say, more in the moderate range may show greater room to move. Is that a fair paraphrase or characterization? So it's an excellent question. The short answer is I'm not sure I have a good answer to it. But one of the things, facts like that, as well as the measurement properties of a number of the particular outcome variables that we've treated. So for example, sort of binomially distributed variables like ones and zeros, successful or unsuccessful mating, have led us to use logistic or generalized models rather than simple linear models whose curve fitting implicitly builds in that shape of possible improvement. Now there may be other factors over and above, other ways that overall aphasia severity impacts the amount of improvement that people can see independent of the room to move question. So for example, there's more room to move in the moderate range, less room to move in the mild range. However, if you think about people at the severe end of the range, there's tremendous amount to move. However, it's commonly attested in studies, including our own studies, that people on the more severe end of the range don't move as much. And that suggests that there is an effective severity over and above sort of this logistic, naturally logistic shaped curve of response. And for that, I'm not sure we have good insight in how to incorporate that dimension of severity, the impact of severity.
We have a question from online. I think I'm loud enough for the audience, but they can also read it, so you don't have to repeat this one. Okay, a question from Amit Amor. As for the first two studies, wouldn't a control group be necessary to demonstrate that this treatment is effective over and beyond being in a room doing some sort of speech therapy for 4 hours a day for 4 weeks? So what's your control?
Right, so it's a fair question. So the controls, which I didn't talk about here, are we have parallel control tasks, which we've collected data for. So non-word oral reading, so one of the PAPA subtests, we collect on exactly the same schedule as the naming probes. So people spend often a distressing amount of time doing non-word oral reading. And what we can say is that doesn't show treatment-related change. That appears to be single. So that uses the logic of a baseline across behaviors. We don't have the logic of a perfect baseline across individuals, and we don't have a control group. That's fair. It would be stronger evidence to have a control group in that way. But we do have some evidence suggesting that we do have spectral control, suggesting that the effects that we see are specific to the treatment.
I was sad to see that there wasn't more effect with the generalization, but I'm wondering if that speaks to the fact that this is an impairment-focused treatment and not an activity participation type treatment, and if that kind of even supports we really need a combination in treatment, and not just focus on one area.
Yeah. So this is so the question. So the observation was there were improvements, but not dramatic improvements in broader measures of communicative function. And is that the sense of generalization you were thinking of? And it is true that we do show statistically significant but not overwhelming changes in these measures. And this is an active, one of the joys of working where I work is that there's a very active partnership and ongoing conversation between the clinical and research staff at VA Pittsburgh. And this is exactly one of the central topics of conversation. Given these accumulating evidence, as well as parallel evidence we've collected for outcomes from our pilot program, which does have a broader approach to treatments involving life participation as well as activity kinds of components. What's the best mix of those to maximize gains? Yeah. So one of the things I'm going to give you a postcard for work that's in progress. We presented preliminary data at Clinical Aphasiology last year, directly comparing outcomes, because we have the same outcome set from our trial and from our pilot program, so which that 100 plus veterans have participated in to date. So we have data that are in progress which directly compare the gains engendered by these two different programs. And we also happily have detailed records of the amount of education time, sort of life participation, approach time, sort of group activity time, as well as focus impairment level treatment time, which these different groups experience. So we can directly not only compare the degree of improvement for the two groups, but model the contribution of these different components of complex treatment packages to that amount of improvement. So stay tuned for that. I would have a more detailed answer to your question soon.
And I'm from Cincinnati, so I hope you don't have a Steeler aphasia group too. In addition to the paragraph.
So the question was how seriously we take pirates in the pirate name, and whether we might have a Reds or Bengals aphasia treatment program in complement to that. We love our pirates as badly as they do every season.
I'm a long-suffering Bengals fan, so.
Yeah. So maybe a clarification question. You mentioned items related untreated items,
yes,
or items that has different degrees of conceptual lexical similarity. But those are all in the untreated items.
Correct. Yes.
And what's the result for that?
Okay, so the question was for the untreated related items. Those are all untreated, so they were never targeted treatment. What was the nature of the semantic relationship? Is that a fair characterization? So what I can say is that they were yoked, picked specifically for per treatment list. So you would have 5 treated items and then 5 untreated items, which were specifically chosen to be related to those. We did that based on a Google-based analog of LSA. We didn't do more recent versions like Google NVEC or Mark Brisberg's Snout, more sophisticated measures of semantic similarity. What we can say is that these are all semantically related, and we can demonstrate that they are at least reasonably semantically related based on sort of published ranges of semantic relationships or tested ranges. However, that said, there is significant variability
across particular treated items, and they're paired untreated friend, in the nature and strength of that semantic relationship. So one of the things that we are doing now as a research team is going through and directly measuring the degree of semantic relationship and the nature of the semantic relationship, and examining how that contributes to the likelihood of generalization. Does, for example, amount of semantic overlap, relative proximity, control the likelihood of generalization, or, for example, whether it's a category correlate or a taxonomically related element, or alternatively an associatively related element. Does that control the likelihood of generalization? Because we have variability within our set along those dimensions. That's work that both Will Evans and Michel Gravier are working on as in collaboration with some other students. So again, a postcard. Please stay tuned for that. Hopefully we'll have more details and more results for that soon.
Another online question. The question is from Jeff, so I'm going to be challenging Jeff.
Hey, Jeff.
Sorry if you addressed this and I missed it. I'm glad to see that feature generation looks like the active ingredient in SFA, but did you think about controlling for the number of times each item was accurately produced in a session, so independent retrieval and or repetition, to rule out the possibility that simply producing the word is driving or contributing to the result?
Yes, so it's worth saying that we do have evidence that simply the act of retrieving the word form does have a positive effect. So that's the effect of the number of tries, the word form retrieval attempts. And it looks like that effect is specific to treated items. Now, it's worth saying that those, if I'm recalling correctly, and my colleagues at home may cringe as I say this out loud, but I believe my memory is correct, that the number of trials reflects what's coded in the treatment record for the word form retrievals does not reflect whether that particular trial involved patient-generated retrieval of that word form or repetition of a clinician-provided generation of that. We know for sure that every trial involved retrieval of the word form by the client, but we can't say based on this whether that was initiated by the individual with aphasia or whether it was initiated by the clinician. However, those data are explicitly coded in our treatment records. So, Jeff, if you'd like to visit us at Reading Pittsburgh and help with analyzing these data, we'd be eager for an extra set of hands and lobes.
Not responding yet. Any questions from here? I see no more questions online, so thank you very much.
Thank you.